Welcome to the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm Libby Franklin. I help produce the festival out of our DC office. And we're really excited about this conversation this morning about the Obama legacy. I'm just here to do a little housekeeping to remind you to silence your cell phone if you haven't already, although I think down here in the basement we shouldn't have too much trouble. And I'm also here to introduce Renée Montagne from NPR. I don't think she needs much of an introduction. I'm sure you'll recognize her voice as soon as she opens her mouth. She's been with NPR since the 80s and done journalism there on every desk, foreign, science, arts, but you all know her as the voice of Morning Edition. So Renée, thanks for being here with us. Welcome.
Great, thank you. Welcome. I hope you're all enjoying your breakfast. It's so early. Although for me, I'm just about ready to get off work, have dinner, and go home. So go to bed. Let me introduce the panelists who I know you all know, partly because you've probably seen all of them in different venues or heard all of them on our air. Also because you have your app, so you know what you're here for. But Michael Eric Dyson, who I'll just say he obviously has been writing books since he was an intern, because there are so many of them, so I'm not even going to begin. Although the latest is, and I should get this title right, and we didn't get a chance to check it, The Black Presidency? That's the title, and there's a subtitle. So the latest is The Black Presidency. And then Susan Page, who is Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, and has met more presidents than any of us maybe could even want to, but we certainly couldn't aspire to, and we'll be talking about that. Evan Thomas, 33 years, Time Magazine. Oh, Evan, sorry, right next to me. Didn't even look left. Richard Haass, Council on Foreign Relations. Another familiar name, I think, and Evan Thomas, who has also written any number of books and has covered just about everything, many covers of Time, and for at least 15 years covered campaigns. Am I right? Okay. So we just want to jump in, and I was saying to all of my folks here, our folks here, that we're trying to mix it up as much as possible. There will be a question and answer period at the end, so have your questions ready. And other than that, I'm going to start with Michael, and partly because both Michael and Susan, for me, have a lot to say about the legacy, which is the subject, the legacy of the politician, Barack Obama. And so, Michael, for you, your book, you've got your book, but also some of you may have seen the New York Times on its new, its weekly opinion page this week, a piece by you, and you really do talk about an extraordinary president who has not been able to deliver in certain ways on his promise. So let me just leave it to you and let you launch into that. When you're thinking legacy, at this moment in time, you're thinking the legacy of a black president.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here this morning, early and chipper with all of you. Try to keep your applause down. I know it's tough out there. I think that I do believe that Barack Obama is a pretty extraordinary guy compared to the guy who was there before him in many ways. Over the long haul, I think he'll stand up pretty well. He might end up being not exactly the black Ronald Reagan in terms of identity, ideology, and inclination, but in terms of the burnish and the shine that attends his legacy, the further we are out from it. I think he faced some rather difficult circumstances, the inheriting of war, the figuring out of the relationship of America to the global, if you will, both marketplace, but also the global economy of war, as well as the ostensible war on terror and what would be the appropriate response of America to that, if one could even acknowledge it as such, and then from there what the terms would be. But furthermore, I think it's pretty obvious to some and increasingly obvious to others that the role of race played a big part in his presidency as well, in terms of both how he was viewed, how he was seen, how he was interpreted, and some of the limits I think that were imposed upon him as well. In terms, say for instance, the first president not to have an automatic rise in the debt ceiling, Democrat or Republican, And when I say, I don't mean racist, but I think racial. You don't have to be racist in intent to have racial consequence. The difference it makes to have the person who is the supposed most powerful person in the world be a black person has forever changed the American presidency. And I think it will be less striking and even remarkable should Hillary Clinton ascend to that throne, so to speak, because of the fact that before her, a huge barrier of difference was broken as a result of a black man occupying it. When I think of legacy, I think very briefly that the legacy that Obama will eventually enjoy is indistinguishable from the perception of him as a black man who was a president and as a president who faced extraordinary barriers. I think that very few of us, perhaps I would think, could deny the revived, recrudescent racial animus that was directed against him. You know, all kind of emails and, you know, political figures across the landscape, especially right-wing figures that week after week, and I kept a tab of this, just came out saying horrible stuff, police departments that were full of individual animus toward him as a figure, and then the notion of a black president. I think in that sense, part of the legacy will be the creation of a tremendous racial anxiety that was answered or found its apotheosis in a figure like Donald Trump. I'm not at all blaming Barack Obama for the rise of Donald Trump, although some of the rough treatment he received, that is the Donald, by Obama in those White House Correspondents' dinners probably egged him on. But the reality is that the vacuum created as a result of Obama's racial procrastination, his hesitancy to engage the issue of race. First of all, because many white brothers and sisters didn't want to speak about it. Some figured that when Obama got elected, been there, done black. As a result of that, we were finished with the issue in a certain way, and Obama was hesitant to do so. Part of his legacy will be creating an enormous opportunity to talk about race, to engage some of the issues but not solve them. And in terms of other issues that we'll get into, I certainly want to speak about whether or not he distinguished himself from George Bush vis-a-vis international issues in regard to the war on terror, whether he continued the exact programs that that the previous president had been criticized for, whether or not he distinguished himself enough by bringing the hopefulness that was resonant in his oratory to bear upon the policies. But I've talked enough, but that's how I would kick it off.
Well, plenty more time. So, Susan, I'm going to, because I'd like you all to speak just briefly, at least before we get into it. And definitely, Michael, there's even questions I have dying to ask you more about this. But Susan Page, you've interviewed rather, and we talked about this, 8 presidents, 5 of them as sitting presidents, including Barack Obama several times. When you look at all previous presidents, and of course you can't really make a full judgment, but how does he fit in, even at this point in time, as you see it, with his legacy? Failed to do certain things, succeeded more than we expected.
I think one thing we shouldn't forget at this point of his presidency is what a remarkable political figure President Obama has been. I was trying to calculate these numbers backstage. We've only had 44 presidents, counting Grover Cleveland twice. Only 38 of them were elected to office. Only 17 were elected twice. So that in itself is a remarkable legacy. And the idea that an African American named Barack Hussein Obama could be elected president of the United States was an extraordinary achievement and one that we shouldn't forget. And I certainly agree with you that that's got big consequences. In covering presidents, they don't always get the legacy they intended to get. And I think that is certainly true for Barack Obama. The animating principle of his campaign in 2008 was getting out of Iraq. That hasn't really proved to be the case, and his handling of that has given, and perhaps he's been too dedicated to the idea of getting out of Iraq, but that was key to him defeating Hillary Clinton for the nomination. He talked a lot in both campaigns about overhauling immigration. He has not achieved that. And most fundamentally of all, that speech, which I'll never forget, in 2004 at the Democratic Convention, that remarkable speech that really launched him as a national figure. He talked about changing the politics of America. And that has certainly not been the case. Not entirely his fault, maybe not much his fault, but that was, I think, the thing that was most appealing to voters in the 2008 election, was the idea that we could get beyond some of the animus and divide and polarization that has only gotten worse. But when you look at his legacy, I think it's pretty substantial, although some of the substantive issues have yet to be resolved. And just very briefly, the groundbreaking nature of his election, the fact that we didn't have a Great Depression after he took over, handling an economic downturn he did not expect to have, passing Obamacare, although we'll wait and see how that works out as it goes more fully into effect, and his use of executive action on climate change and immigration. One last thing to watch for his legacy: does he help elect a Democrat to succeed him? Does he help elect Hillary Clinton to office? Because one thing we know from the Reagan experience, having a president follow you after your 2 terms is a way to solidify and extend whatever you have done in your own 8 years.
So I'm going to jump over you, Richard, for just one moment, because I'd like to expand on that just a little bit. Oh, sorry. Couldn't you hear me? No, I'm sorry. I should hold my own mic here. I'm going to, Evan Thomas, let me just ask, just while we're somewhat on the economy, it seems like President Obama has not gotten credit for a couple of big things he's done. One of them is a 5% unemployment rate. I mean, any way to make that look like it's not as good as 5% seems to be, but also people seem to forget it. Is there some part of what could be his legacy that is just for various political reasons, or that is just seem to be not on the radar or underappreciated?
Well, I think presidents get too much credit and too much blame for the economy generally. They always talk about the president's economy. It's not. It's a global economy. Presidents increasingly have little effect on it. So I think that's a bit of a bump steer. The thing that I think that Obama deserves, well, I look at him in two sides of the same coin. On the negative side, and I do fault him for this, his unwillingness or maybe his inability to get his hands dirty on just capital politics, his unwillingness to go up to Capitol Hill and play golf with people he doesn't like. That is part of the job, and he just wouldn't do it. He played golf, I think, with Boehner once. Most of the time he plays with his pals. But that is part of a president's job, is to go hang around with congressmen whom you do not like. And he just didn't want to do that. It's almost like he was above that. And in times I felt he was almost condescending about, I'm doing you a favor to be president. There was a kind of haughtiness to him, and that I found to be objectionable and sad. Now, it begs a big question. Even if he had gone up there and played a lot of golf, would it have made any difference? Because that's such an intractable, difficult, impossible group. It would have just been an exercise in frustration, and to hell with it. So I'm sympathetic to that. But he didn't try. He did not try. The flip side of this coin, however, is, and Richard's going to be smarter about this and may disagree with this, I think in his second term, Obama has shown a great capacity to stay out of stay out of it. They say that foreign policy is not don't do stupid stuff, as no foreign policy. It is to me. I think Obama was actually pretty smart about avoiding foreign entanglement. Now, I can feel Richard vibrating here next to me. So I think we're about to hear a different view of this. But to my layman, non-professional view, I think his ability to stay out of trouble was good.
Well, okay, we're going to Richard now, but I will say one thing, and that does get us to foreign policy. And we spoke about this a little bit backstage. I just by a fluke happened to be in Afghanistan when President Obama gave his speech to cadets at. I'm blocking on it. In any event, he gave a speech saying what he was going to do in Afghanistan. West Point. And I got the reaction from Afghans, which was this big excitement for like a moment, like, about 30,000 more troops. And then when he said, but they'll all come out in, I think it was 2011, that was the original deadline. It turned out to be quite a bit later. There was this great, everybody was deflated because it was simply, it's that old line about, the West has all the clocks and we, the Taliban, have all the time. So it was a meaningless, from the point of view of Afghans, it appeared to be almost meaningless. It was just buying them a little bit of time. So go from there and talk to us about foreign policy in the Obama era.
Happy to.
And then we can just start talking.
I would say one thing about the foreign policy legacy. As opposed to the domestic policy legacy, domestic policy, the president has less latitude under our political system, given the Constitution. It's more shared with Congress and the rest. And so when one looks at his economic legacy or healthcare or whatever, I think it's almost harder to discern. In the foreign policy arena, presidents have more latitude, have more discretion. So there it's slightly less difficult, with the obvious caveat that it's too soon to tell. We'll see how certain things play out. But that said, the bottom line of his foreign policy legacy, I think, will be quite negative. I think that historians will begin with the honest take that the world is in worse shape today than when he inherited it, which is not to say he didn't inherit a challenging inbox. By the way, all presidents do. He obviously, though, did inherit the particularly challenging dimension of what his predecessor did in Iraq. But I do think the beginning of Barack Obama's problems in foreign policy was an overreaction to that. And if George W. Bush, will go down in history as a president who erred by trying to do too much, by undertaking what I termed an ill-advised war of choice to try to transform Iraq, and he set in motion all sorts of dynamics in the Middle East. I believe Barack Obama will, for the most part, be seen as a president who tried to do way too little, particularly in the Middle East. And what we're seeing is that acts of omission are every bit as consequential as acts of commission. And I believe the history will be most brutal on him for Syria, for essentially looking at the problem, every time looking at the options, not liking them, letting it sit for 6 months, coming back to it, and each time the situation grew worse. I think history will be particularly tough on him for saying that Assad must go and then doing nothing to bring it about, and there was a consistent gap between his rhetoric and his policies in the Middle East. I think history will be, above all, tough on him on the so-called red line in Syria, to say that chemical weapons, if they were to be used, would be met with all sorts of consequences when they were not. Nothing did more to undermine his authority and the reputation of the United States than his inaction in Syria, and the fact that chemical weapons were ultimately disposed of in no way erases that reality. It had all sorts of consequences for the strengthening of the government, the weakening of the opposition, and the rise of ISIS and groups like al-Nusra. Afghanistan, Renee already mentioned, he was divided between what to do and what not to do. His whole mindset was one of retrenchment. He was getting pressured, though, to do more. What he did was split the difference. I'm going to go up for a little bit, but then I'm going to come out. And that kind of splitting the difference is the worst of all worlds. It didn't work. One area where he did too much was Libya. Went in, I believe, under arguments that just didn't bear scrutiny. People wanted to be on the right side of history, and as Bob Gates, then the Secretary of Defense, questioningly said, what the hell does that mean? We got into Libya, we did too much, and then afterwards we didn't follow it up. So he got it wrong going in, and he got it wrong, if you will, staying out there. We could go around the region more, but I think history will essentially note a consistent problem of a gap between what it was we sought to do and what it was we were prepared to do. And the fact is, the Middle East is by far the least stable, most unsuccessful part of the world with the worst prospects. I'm not saying it's all his fault. Locals deserve the lion's share of the responsibility. As I said, he inherited a difficult situation, but he got dealt a bad hand, and he made it much worse by the way he played it. I'd say two other things. In Europe, the situation is also considerably worse. There, I think it's more for local reasons. Asia is the most interesting part of his legacy. The big foreign policy idea of Barack Obama, the biggest single idea, was not simply retrenchment from the Middle East, but was to dial up in Asia, The word was sometimes called pivot, sometimes a rebalance, but essentially the correct assessment that the 21st century was much more likely to be played out in Asia. That's where the people are, that's where the wealth is, that's where the rising countries are, that's where the major powers of this era are, and that the United States was going to shift, dial, if you will, greater attention and focus on Asia, less on the Middle East and Europe. The problem was, again, the gap between rhetoric and policy. It wasn't followed up diplomatically, particularly in the second term. The Asia policy got orphaned to some extent. The military buildup came belatedly. Above all, the single most important part of the pivot, which is the economic, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade agreement between the United States and 11 other countries representing some 40% of the world economy, and that is parked. We can't get it past the American political system, and that's my last point, where I think Barack Obama has not succeeded in Brexit. I'm not blaming it on him, but it's part of a larger problem. He has not spent an awful lot of calories trying to persuade the American people of the inevitable, not just the reality of globalization, but how America needs to interact with global challenges in a way that there would be global support. And what we've seen is the erosion of American support for free trade, erosion of American support for immigration, and so forth. So on his watch, we're seeing a greater turning away from the world. And by the way, this is not a partisan thing. We're seeing in the Republican Party, obviously, with Donald Trump, saw it just as much with Bernie Sanders. What we're seeing across the American body politic is a distancing from the world, and that would be tragic if that were to become the foreign policy legacy of Barack Obama.
Well, could I ask, and anyone of the four of you? Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's this microphone.
I'm just enjoying myself and listening. And this could go to any one of you. I've always had the impression that President Obama did not really have a taste. He certainly didn't have a taste for war. Foreign wars, he wanted out. He promised to get out. He got out. But that he also really wanted to focus on domestic policy, and to the degree that foreign policy fed into that, like the trade agreements and whatnot, that was his sweet spot. And I'm wondering if this could go to any of you, what you think about that this was just something, if he could have not, despite Cairo's speech, despite the Nobel Peace Prize, that he really could have, if he could have handed it off, he would have.
Well, I'm not sure he could have handed it off, but it's certainly true if you look at his history, was domestic, right? He was involved in community organizing. He was in the state legislature. He spent just a brief time in the U.S. Senate. So his focus as an adult was not on foreign policy. And in fact, I think it's probably fair to say in the let me ask Richard this, in the post-war era, he had the lightest background in foreign policy of any president before his presidency.
The one area he did have background, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Right.
That's actually where I first met him, he was on that committee. So he had, I would not say George W. Bush had extensive, compared to George Herbert Walker Bush.
Right.
But Ronald Reagan hadn't had extensive experience in foreign policy.
Ronald Reagan had two terms as governor that had some foreign policy element. And I guess we give George W. Bush, maybe this is not correct, but some sense that maybe he knew something just from being around his dad, but perhaps that didn't work out.
Well, it might have meant that he cared. He cared
but
more.
I think it's definitely true that Barack Obama cared less about foreign policy and less about kind of the politics that Evan was talking about, like how you actually twist arms or get relationships going in Washington, than most presidents and other presidents I've interviewed, but cared more about domestic policy and kind of the intellectual part of the presidency.
He did make that initial foray. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, after all. That maybe
a little early.
A little early, but he did make that, and he made those initial speeches. He went to America's going to project a different face to the world. Richard, did he just drop the ball after that? He did stake an initial position that you should look at us differently.
Well, the most extraordinary thing in terms of foreign policy initially was his getting elected. I should have had a nickel for every foreign leader or individual who said to me, "You Americans are amazing. The fact that Barack Obama could get elected in the United States, something like that could never happen in our country." And it was one of those reminders, in the positive sense of the word, of American exceptionalism. So I think he started out with tremendous, the account was high. He had banked a lot. There was a lot of excitement. I think, though, he hurt himself in several ways. One is, I actually would have advised him to say no to the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it would have been a much smarter thing to say, let me earn it. let me earn it. And if I earn it, I'd love to come back and get it. Don't give it to me. You're not doing me any favors. I thought the Cairo speech,
Michael.
I thought the Cairo speech was a mistake. It also was another thing where he didn't go to Israel on that trip. And instead, the initial reaction, if you remember, policy of the administration was to start something of a confrontation with Israel over settlements without first establishing a relationship. So I think he had troubles from the outset. And again, so much of it was based on the idea that the biggest single fix to American foreign policy would be accomplished by doing less, getting out of Iraq, getting out of Afghanistan. And I think that was since he overlearned the lesson of the mistakes of his predecessor. And it's 10 more. We were talking about it before we came on here. Everyone always says you ought to apply the lessons of history. The problem is there's no place to go for the right lessons of history. And I think Barack Obama's real problem was he entered office with a mindset that was inconsistent with the reality he inherited.
Yeah, well, as far as the Nobel Prize turning it down, he was representing for the brothers there. It's not many of us on that list, and he had to take one for the people. When they offer you one and you turn it down, that's going to be interesting. Ain't nobody turning down no Nobel Prize. But I get your point in terms of the kind of deference. But I want to ask, just take a poll up on this stage even, and out here. How many of you in the last year, 2 week, month, maybe decade have spoken before a black church? Okay. How many routinely? Okay, my man. Did you preach? You preach? Oh, boy, I got to hear that sermon. Routinely, not one time, time and time again, right? Look around this room. Think about what Barack Obama as a black man had to inherit. The conditions conspire for you or against you. The logic that you inherit what you think is important. If Obama goes into office, right, I'm gonna speak to the left wing and then the foreign policy stuff. The left wing is mad, oh my God, you bailed out the banks. First black president allows the banks to fail. Forget a second term, he might not have got a second week, all right? Not happening. In terms of the economy, we know George Bush began what he then inherited, TARP money, distribution of resources to try to get this economy going. It is pretty remarkable, 5%, although at its height, black unemployment was something like 16%, Latino employment, maybe 12, 13%. And Obama's policies never were targeted toward those most vulnerable populations that happened to be Latino or black. Bailed out the automobile industry. Mitt Romney was like, let them eat brakes. Okay, sorry, Surly. And said, don't do it. And Obama bailed him out. And then health care. I think when we look back, we're gonna see how remarkable it was. Playing golf, of course, with people who don't like you, right. That's exactly right. And I think that you're not the first person to indicate, and I've known Obama since, 92? We were at the same church in Chicago and hung out, and I was very friendly with him. It is true that is the knock on him. He's not, hail fellow well met. He doesn't glad hand. He doesn't like the sausage making. He's not Bill Clinton, right? Because in that case, as has been said, Bill Clinton is a dog and Barack Obama's a cat. I don't mean dog in any other way than as a canine. And the 99 people in the room, the dog goes to the one person that doesn't like him. 99 people love you, the one person doesn't, the dog wants to know, why don't you like him? The cat is like, you could really kiss my ass. If you like me, it's great, and if you don't like me, it's fine. And there is that kind of finicky Obama approach. There's no question about it. It's ironic. You see it as a mark of derogation and perhaps a dark mark, a black mark on his record. What progress in America for it to be considered a black man being snobby toward the masses of white people? Man, that's racial progress. And so, but you can't win being a brother, right? And this is what I'm trying to say. Imagine playing golf with a guy who thinks, people who think you're a terrorist, people who think you're a Muslim, people who think that you are anti-American, people who think that you are fundamentally opposed, even the most, elegant opposition that could be conjured, and I wouldn't put John Boehner in that. The people who really fundamentally disbelieve in your humanity. And at a certain level, you've got to shield yourself from the onslaught. I've never been president, but I imagine it's a pretty tough job. And one of the things you have to do is to take care of your own mental health. We never talk about that in the process of trying to govern a nation that has, for the first time, half of that nation disbelieves in your essential humanity, half the nation practices a politics of disregard or benign neglect in a certain way. So I just would ask us to think about what it might mean. The reason I asked the question about the black church thing, imagine if day after day, routinely, you had to go to a HBCU, you had to go to an African American or a Latino question, you had to deal with a barrio. Imagine in terms of the inherited vocabulary, in terms of the grammar of consent about American ideals. Imagine the presumption of a certain kind of simpatico, all of which are absent. And then imagine having to step into that gulf and then govern a nation in a way, and then have a global politics that deals with the ideals of America. Of course, Obama's going to be hyper exceptional. Of course, Obama is going to be reticent to do anything to get America in the path of greater war from his own mind. So I take the point about the red line, Syria, Libya, what happened, especially vis-a-vis the Secretary of State. But imagine, if you will, what that means from a person who's been taught part of his biracial inheritance is a kind of, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, of always moderating and mediating and trying to find a middle pathway in order to work. And I think part of that, if the foreign policy has been leading from behind, the domestic policy on certain issues that have been strategic inadvertence of Obama in regard to race and in regard to ethnicity may also prevail in ways that are counterproductive. But I just want us to imagine the difficulty of what that might mean to be the first black president and to have to govern accordingly with peoples whose suspicion and skepticism are deep and thick in one's own country, and then figuring out the global landscape and the geopolitics of that internationally. I just wanted to jump in there.
Can I jump in and ask a question?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question, though?
Sure.
I mean, Barack Obama, I know him a little, I don't know him as well as you, but he strikes me as one of the more disciplined people I've ever met.
Extremely.
Okay, so one of the things that it takes to be a successful president, you can't just be the job, you got to do the job.
Absolutely.
And I agree with exactly your characterization. There's some politicians who walk into a room and interact with people and come out with more energy, Bill Clinton. And there's some who walk into a room and come out depleted. And Barack Obama is very much of the latter category. That said, for someone who's disciplined, who wants to succeed at the job, why is it that Barack Obama didn't use his rhetorical powers more to, in a sense, turn the Oval Office into a classroom to bring the American people in? Okay, you didn't have to play golf every week with John Boehner, but maybe a few times. I mean, I play golf with people I don't like all the time. And, so...
We played last week, is that? No, okay.
So why is it that he didn't... Here's someone who has acute self-awareness. When he works an audience, he works it with the timing and the interaction of a professional. Why wasn't he able, in some ways, to adjust his own behavior to make himself what could have been a more successful president?
That's a great point. I mean, it's a great question. Partly, as you know, now I've been a preacher for 35 years, among other things. And, people say, well, we are looking for a great sermon today. I always tell people, it would be a great audience, and you're going to get a great damn sermon. But if you sit on your hands and look at me like, I don't know what I'm talking about, it's going to be tough. So the call and response is critical. The great speech making he gave, notice when he gave those great speeches, people, you're before your mama's audience, so to speak. You had the convention in 2004, not a white America, but a black America, but this is, oh yes. And then out of nowhere he bolts. But the point you make, so I'm saying, A, it's predicated upon a kind of reciprocity and a call and response where not necessarily people who believe in what you're doing, but people who are eager to hear it and therefore return in kind the kind of energy you might give. But number two, to your point, I think that, look, if it's been, as it's been said, that the greatest effect and impact of the presidency is the rhetorical presidency, to your point, and that the bully pulpit is an extension, a la Roosevelt, but since then, those presidents, LBJ, Ronald Reagan, who have commandeered that pulpit to say something to America, I think that Barack Obama felt that he had to pick and choose his spots. And I think that once the sausage-making stuff, once the daily administration, once the stuff that you hate doing, has to be done, because your point about it's not, you not only kind of be the job, you got to do the job, that kind of distinction, I think once that's set in, with the huge obligation of that office to try as greatly as possible to master the mechanics of public policy and the application of that policy to a political framework that was resistant to him existentially, but he's trying to embrace ideologically. I think that was a heavy burden for him. So in that sense, I would have loved for the same kind of speech-making, speechifying, rhetorical magic that was deployed to be used more often. But I do believe, you've got your finger on one thing here, is that what sets in is the remarkable recognition that so many people are invested in your failure. That's all presidents. Let's not pretend that that's unique to Barack Obama. But when you put the overlay of what he's dealing with historically, I think it sat on his vocal cords to a certain degree.
You know, I just wonder about his, President Obama's pretty popular right now, comparatively. Wasn't the case in just very recent times, but he was very popular when he took office, and he's personally popular, and the First Lady's popular. I wonder if some of the issue has to do with the times, and you mentioned Brexit, this notion that, that the elite, and he's the elite at this point, doesn't know how to speak to regular folks, really, generally speaking. And one thing about President Obama is when he's not, his oratory is not soaring, he comes across like a professor who's lecturing people that he's talking to. Even his voice, I know from radio, I can tell you, it's very much better when you're looking at him than when you're just hearing him. Because his voice has a sort of, like I say, lecturing tone and whatnot, but his face doesn't say that. I mean, I don't think he is, I heard the word preacher. I don't think he is a preacher by nature. I think he is a professor by nature. And has that worked against him? And I only bring up Brexit because a lot of the suspicion of the elites and the experts had to do with the feeling that they were so out of touch and practically on another planet. Just wondering, anybody could come in on that.
Could we stop using the word elite so pejorative?
Well, yeah, sorry.
Here we are at the Aspen Ideas Festival, really. I mean, let's get real here.
This is grassroots as this gets right here. I love
this is where the elite comes to meet.
Well, there you go. This is a good time to talk about it, don't you think?
Right.
It's a
I
group
think
to
one
talk
of
to
the reasons, actually I've thought a lot about why his popularity is going up so much recently. The only thing I can think of is that it's playing off the campaign. And in some ways you're having early on nostalgia for Barack Obama, the style of his presidency, the way he handles himself personally, the dignity and the way he manages the office. And I think in a funny sort of way, whatever a lot of people think about the disagreement over policies, the respect for the person, and again, the style matters in the ultimate sense. I think the style of his presidency is one that people find admirable, and I think that's more than anything else. Not that his policies have changed in the last 2 months, but I think people are...
He seems dignified. Right. And in the age of Trump, he seems dignified.
Is dignified. I wouldn't say seem.
I would say is.
But there's first of all, being a professor, saying that you sound like a professor is never an insult to me. But having said that, yeah, there is a kind of pedantic, obtuse pedantry, as Walter Kaufman spoke about Nietzsche. Yeah, there, in terms of the approach. Yeah, so you could have that kind of stuff that's problematic, and it's the law school professor. I remember telling him, to your point, when he landed, I made a big endorsement the first time around at the Essence Festival with like 25,000 black people in the stadium, and he had just been in a debate with Hillary Clinton, and so he's two of his advisors, and I'm riding in the seat next to him, he's got a little sniffle, and I say, Hillary Clinton is really killing you. And the people, I said, I thought we were being honest, I'm sorry. I thought we were gonna tell the truth. And then he says, no, go ahead. I said, dude, you're doing like, you're giving great speeches on Rauschenbusch and the nature of theology and its application. I said, that's great, I'm interested in that, but you're killing the audience. I said, so if you could do like Hillary, number 1, number 2, and number 3. I said, now that's where the preaching would come in. I said, you might, find Jesse Jackson problematic, but you cannot forget what he's saying. Up with hope and down with dope. I'm still remembering that 50 years later, all right? Our time has come. I said, get you some Jesse Jackson phrases and hook it up. And he said, you can help me. I said, yeah, I'm just saying, you got to do this. So he's not, to the manner born in terms of his rhetorical skill, even though he's one of the great orators. But the tradition from which he emerges, there's a black preacher with 12 members of his church on a corner in Harlem who can outpreach most American orators. It's just, You know, Paul Tillich said one of the great arrogances of his own Germanic theology was to presume it was the best in the world. Well, I'll retain that for black preaching. I think the density of black preaching in terms of its rhetorical suave and its swagger is pretty intense. And Obama uses that at certain points. The speech in after Charleston, what he did in Boston. So yeah, but he's torn between that kind of style and the kind of professorial engagement that certainly looks to many people condescending. But again, look at this. It's tough because as a black man, I know growing up when I got, you know, you'll get a PhD at these Ivy League schools like I did at Princeton, they tell you, well, we don't want a black person who can't, you know, dot his I's and cross his T's and speak eloquently and know a bunch of stuff. And then when you start doing that, you're getting called an elite. And thanks for the defense. You know, you say, well, damn, I'm from the hood, now I'm an elite, there's no middle ground. What happened? And so I think that Obama is facing, again, a difficult thing because he is an extremely bright guy. He was a law professor. That kind of style, of course, is germane to the kind of, you know, Socratic dialogue, but I think at the end of the day, the reason he's now, I think, more popular is that he's reclaimed the very thing that he's been disciplined, to use your word, against. That is to say, look, in basketball, they say, I only play up to what the defense gives me. Obama is playing to what the defense gives him. And right now, Donald Trump is handing most American politicians who are not of that ilk a beautiful gift. All you have to do is breathe and not be a jerk, and you are seen as a superior human being. And then beyond that, the ability to look at the amplification of the worst bigotries and the horrid biases that prevail. I think this is Obama's sweet spot because it reminds America of the very thing that he was contrasted to. And as a result of that, I think that with that and then with extending through Hillary, I think that potential has awakened something in him, but also made the American public more eager for the very brand of politics that he might bring.
We have 15 minutes for questions. So as you can see, we can keep talking forever. Go ahead. Sorry, right behind you, but you'll be next.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
The whole panel. How much do you think of the inability or the lack of forming a no-fly zone or establishing a no-fly zone in Syria has contributed to the subsequent mass immigration problem Europe is now seeing, and the concomitant infiltration of potential terrorist agents because of that?
Could I just tack on to that question, because it was something I was curious about. How easy would it have been to establish a no-fly zone? Because I think at the time, Iraq was a beaten country, and it was an easy thing to do. Would that have been an easy thing to do with Assad and his firepower?
For those who couldn't hear, the question was about whether the decision not to establish a no-fly zone, the consequences of it, among other things, the refugee flows. The debate about the no-fly zone came not at the beginning, but sometime into the Syrian debacle. Yes, a no-fly zone could have been created, but it's a terrible phrase because it suggests what you do is simply put air power in. And a no-fly zone requires all sorts of ground forces. Because if you're going to protect people, you can't just have an air cover of them. You have to protect them from soldiers, from tanks, from howitzers, and everything else. So my point simply being, in order to have established a zone in which or under which Syrian civilians could have been safe, you would have needed a large ground component. And if we were not going to provide that, and there was lots of resistance to it, then we needed local forces, be they Turkish or Arab, to do it, and those easier said than done. The reason there were massive refugee flows were, yes, because of the fundamental instability in Syria, but also the Turkish government, until recently, was doing very little to control its border in either direction. So ISIS was using Turkey as a major recruiting path, and refugees were going out through Turkey until the recent deal between the EU and Turkey. But a no-fly zone is not a panacea. It's one of these phrases that's bandied about. I think probably the moment for it, if it ever existed, is past, because now you've got Russian aircraft. And if you're going to establish a no-fly zone, you've got to be prepared to contemplate the consequences of that. So the options now are probably, I know it's not a panel in Syria, but 30 seconds. It's things like giving Syrian forces much more capable arms, among other things, advanced air defense systems so they could protect areas, more special forces, possibly some strikes on Syrian aircraft on the ground, and so forth, using cruise missiles. So there's things we can do, but I think the debate about the no-fly zone has probably come and gone.
Sir.
I'll address my question to Richard. What if the guy in front of you, there's a big anthill, a big anthill, and the guy in front of you just kicks it over, and then the guy behind you is then left to solve all these problems, and the American people are tired of their sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, shedding their blood because of the guy in front of you kicked over the anthill.
Okay, as I said, Barack Obama inherited a tough hand, and I think history, will be quite critical, shall we say, of his predecessor for the Iraq War. No argument about it. But again, that was the situation he inherited. No one forced him to run for president. He knew he was going to inherit that situation. And the question then is, did he deal with it as best he might have? Granted, and you're exactly right, the intervention fatigue that characterized the country, given both Afghanistan and Iraq, because more than 2 million Americans at one time served in uniform in those two conflicts. So there was intervention fatigue for all sorts of good reasons. My criticism of President Obama was then the things he did and didn't do. Then I would have said, why do Libya? Why pull certain troops out where small numbers of troops could have kept situations stable, and arguably in both Afghanistan and Iraq? Why set out rhetorical goals that raised expectations and raised pressures on the United States to follow up with troops if your entire mindset was not to do that? So what I simply found were tremendous inconsistencies in his foreign policy. And at the end of the day, no one has, it's almost a red herring. No one is talking about wars on the scale of Afghanistan or Iraq. No one is talking about large footprint wars. We're not talking about transforming Middle East societies. But he has a lot to answer to, and he can do it in his memoirs and other ways, with statements made and decisions taken about everything from Egypt to Syria to Iraq to Afghanistan. We could go through the region and Libya without raising the question of the sort of large military involvement that the American people, I think, understandably rejected.
And if I could just say, I met Richard Haass when I was working for Newsday and covering the George H.W. Bush White House. And so George H.W. Bush, a president who had strengths and weaknesses, like all of them. I remember with the invasion of Kuwait, when he came back from Camp David that Sunday, I was there on the South Lawn when he got off the helicopter and said, "This will not stand," which made us all stand up a little straighter. And unlike the red line that President Obama set and then allowed to be crossed, I think we all had the impression that for whatever reasons, George H.W. Bush meant that this was not going to stand. And then he devoted every day of his presidency to making that case. And he didn't do some other things he wanted to do as president because he was determined to deal with this particular foreign policy problem that he saw as so crucial. And he was not a great orator, but he did an education campaign for the American people to bring them along with the idea that the United States had to intervene in this country that many Americans probably couldn't pick out on a map. And in furtherance of that, poor Richard Haass had to meet with reporters like every day on the White House beat in small groups in your little office, your tiny office in the old executive office building.
It wasn't that small.
Well, it was pretty small, kind of shabby, but
Your tax dollars not at work.
But with, so there I'm a reporter with Newsday, which was a wonderful newspaper, but not it's not like I was working for CBS. And he met. I must have met with him or Brent Scowcroft or Jim Baker or somebody else with a small group every week because they were trying to make the case that this was the right thing to do, and they were doing it in every single way they could. And they said, whatever George H.W. Bush didn't succeed, on this, he succeeded because he decided to succeed and he did the things that he needed to do to make that stand.
But I think, in light of that, I think that contrary to what you might argue, I think he's going to be seen with the anthill as the guy who saved us from John Wayne political swagger and made the world far more susceptible to the politics of terror that we see going on now. So the irony is he halves George Bush's legacy. He repudiates the kind of commercial and goes for the product. Number two, look at the game has changed, so to speak, in terms of the large theaters, the massive deployment of troops or not to deploy troops, the red lines drawn. That is kind of analog stuff. We're dealing with digital. And in the digital warfare, so to speak, if you follow my analogy, then Obama's going to be seen as a precursor. Now, some will say great and some will say horrible, of a kind of individualized warfare vis-a-vis drone strikes and also killing people on a terror list, right? And some may find that extremely reprehensible, find it problematic in the extreme and the like, but I think that the shift in paradigm there is something that he'll be given credit for and seen to have faced a nearly impossible situation whose outcome we do not know yet, as we saw in Istanbul yesterday.
We are going to have time for
Sure.
about 2 more questions at best. I'm just going to take a wild point here, and ma'am. Right in the middle, right where you can't get to the right to the microphone very easily, and then see what we can.
So following up on the comments that have been made about the bully pulpit and what perhaps the president could have done better to have sold or educated people on a particular issue like globalization, I'm struck by the fact that on a number of critical issues, there actually is a broad consensus among the American people. Infrastructure investment, tax reform, immigration reform, gun reform, climate change, and yet we have not been able to see political progress made. So I'm curious as to what the panel thinks, looking ahead, as to whether there are structural impediments that if we don't deal with, whether those are redistricting reform or changing the filibuster or money in politics, we're not going to be able to move forward regardless of what the skills oratorically are of the next president.
There is one big deal that Obama did not even try for that is sitting out there and has to happen. And that is massive spending on infrastructure, an electric grid, bridges, all that stuff that we're not doing, in exchange for entitlement reform. Now, those things are really hard to do, but there is a deal. Most people agree it exists. Obama didn't even make a head fake at that. And I think he mentioned it, but he barely did anything. And I think the feeling is that the structural obstacles in Congress are so great that you just couldn't get it done. Too many filibusters, couldn't get 60, just couldn't get it done. I think what has to happen is that a president has to run on it. It has to be, vote for me, and you have a mandate to do these things, these very hard things to do. We've got to spend a ton of money on our infrastructure, and sooner or later, we got to deal with entitlements. We just can't kick it down the road forever because all of our kids are going to be in a terrible place if we don't. Obama didn't try for that. Somebody's going to have to do it. I don't think you can do entitlement reforms on their own. I don't actually think you can do infrastructure on its own. But I think if you try to do them together, there's a deal that can be made.
I don't know if we read Draper's book, and when people meet the day you're getting inaugurated and say that their greatest goal is to block anything you do and to make you an unsuccessful president, what the hell? I mean, what he won't do? I mean, are we imagining what that means for the American public? It's not about structural impediments, which is very important, that prevent the flourishing of the American consensus around certain ideas. A lot of stuff that Obama knew was consensus of American folk was being blocked in Congress and by perverse levels of obstruction. I just don't think we're being honest up here in terms of the white versus black, about ultimately the hatred for Obama as the very epitome, not just racially speaking, but ideologically speaking and politically speaking, of something that was so reprehensible. And the irony is, if you don't like this black guy, ain't one that's been made that you're gonna really dig. This guy is really as willing and hungry and eager to compromise, to sit down at the table and let's talk about our differences. I just happen to think, I just very much disagree with that. I think that the eyes and ears of his opposition were determined to think, see, and write anything that would oppose anything that was reasonable. And we can go down in terms of executive orders, forget whether the Supreme Court blocks you on immigration. He can't even generate a febrile consensus about that. Gun control, you gotta have John Lewis sitting in Congress to even to draw attention to what the inaction is about and the consequences to the American public. So I just happen to believe that at the end of the day, if you hate the guy that bad and you wanna see him fail, there's nothing you can do except become Jesus, and then you get crucified.
Let me just say one thing about that. He ran for re-election. He ran for re-election. That was the moment to ask to do the hard things. He did not ask the American people. He had a chance. That was his chance when he ran for. He won re-election, but that was his chance to ask to do.
Tell me what you mean by ask the American public. Like what? You mean through what means? I'm literally
vote
asking.
for me, and you're voting for massive spending on infrastructure and entitlement reform, and maybe throw in tax reform.
But let's just say he did that. How would it get done?
You asked for a mandate. You asked for a mandate. You vote for me, and you're instructing Congress to do
I'd say
it.
two things.
Yeah, he
One,
heard that song with the Temptations, and it didn't.
First of all, opposition to, look, the fact that there's racism, and that explains some of the opposition to Barack Obama, no one's going to dispute that. But the rule of intensity in American politics was not invented 8 years ago. Small minorities that are truly intense in their political behavior have the ability to block large majorities. That's the reason we don't have more gun control than we have. That's the reason we don't have entitlement reform. That was not invented 7.5 years ago, but in issue after issue, small groups with real commitment and intensity have outsized political impact. I would say that one thing—
What do they share in common?
And the one thing I would have said about Barack Obama is one of the rules of American politics. You want to do big things in American politics that last, you do it bipartisan. The biggest thing he did, arguably, was the Affordable Care Act. And it was done, though, without Republican support. A very different way to have done it would have been to work it much more with Republicans rather than franchising it out. But not, if you want to have lasting big reforms from civil rights to other issues, there's got to be a bipartisan dimension. Otherwise, it will never put down roots. It will never be seen as legitimate. Would it have been easy? Of course not. But would it have been possible? I would have said to have taken much more of a run at a bipartisan approach to affordable care and to health care reform, only as a fallback. It would not have been my initial approach the way this administration went about it.
But LBJ could do bipartisanship because he was a white Southern Texas guy who was seen as one of us. And so when he collared these people, and Dick Russell and so on, and he forced his agenda through, A, it was a different time and place in terms of American politics, but B, he was a different kind of guy. Imagine Barack Obama in 1965 as president. Of course, that's contradictory because the Voting Rights Act didn't exist. But if we can imagine, my point is bipartisanship, the people who were on the opposite side of the aisle couldn't even concede the legitimacy of your, for a long time, Donald Trump leading, your American citizenship, your legitimacy as a political figure, and then the refusal to work with you because of the cantankerous resistance. I'm not saying that that kind of partisan vigor was invented 7 years ago, 7.5 years ago, but I'll tell you what was invented 7.5 years ago, a black presidency. I'll tell you what was invented. For the first time, America reached out to a figure to say, because of your merit and your quality, not your race, although that was a tremendous bonus, and we bought into that because we saw that that was a tremendous barrier that had to be lowered. But let's not pretend that Barack Obama didn't inherit not only George Bush's political prescriptions and his policy recommendations. He inherited a culture that for hundreds of years has been incapable of ceding the legitimacy, just like Hillary Clinton will challenge that gender barrier as well. And I just don't think we're acknowledging enough this ostensible fantasy world where bipartisanship exists without, I don't know, hating the guy, without feeling that he's not truly American, and without truly feeling that he's not really human. At that level, I just think it's extremely hard to forge bipartisan consensus in a culture that didn't. By the way, had they been willing to just give a little, look at what Obama could have done. Look at what our legacy contributions, look at what our legacy conversations would have been had they worked with him even a little bit. I just think it's extremely unfair to ask him to exist in that kind of situation.
the legacy of Barack Obama, we have, he'll be leaving the presidency, and we'll soon find out how it all shakes out, or at least it'll begin to shake out more. Evan Thomas, Richard Haass, Susan Page, Michael Eric Dyson, thank you so very much for this conversation.